I'm hoping that we get to a day where it isn't female filmmaker and male filmmaker, it's just filmmaker. So how do you feel about this whole dysfunction thing that's happening in the filmmaking world as it pertains to female film critics and female filmmakers?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you completely because, I think craft is colorblind. When I'm approaching a film, I look at all kinds of films as references and more films that are interesting in terms of style, right? I don't necessarily look at a film based on the culture or it's more about how do I frame a shot? What are some of the family films that inspire me? How do I do comedy in a way that hasn't been done before? How do I show pathos and humor in the same frame? And I can draw from, all kinds of influences. So I think it's tricky when someone says, how do you make a Asian American family drama? To me, Asian American isn't a genre,
it's
of filmmaking.
A human.
It's a human. It's a type of human. Well, what's a white drama look like? I don't, those filmmakers don't go into telling a story thinking about identity. In many ways, when I was approaching this film about my family, I just set out a film to tell a story about a granddaughter and a grandmother, a film about family and about loss and about grief and about guilt when you leave. We don't look at ourselves every day and go, oh my gosh, I'm Asian.
I overstand. Yes, I overstand. I don't look in the mirror and go, oh, I am a black girl. What have happened?
Yeah, well, exactly. And how do I, do something really, Asian today? I think about Hannah Gatsby's Nanette because I watched it recently and I loved it so much. And she said that she's had feedback where people go, there was just not enough lesbian content in your show. And she's like, I'm confused. I was on stage the entire time. And it's like, yes, the story is about an Asian American family because that is the texture of my life. That is who I am. Every story I tell is an Asian American story because that is my voice. I can't escape it.
Yeah, there's such an authentic sense of camaraderie within the Central family in the farewell. I was wondering if there was anything special you did to create that environment on set or off set in terms of getting your cast to bond with each other. Because when we're hanging out with the family, you're like, I'm just looking in a window in these people's lives.
Mike Lee is a huge reference for me. I'm very inspired by his films. He gets 40 days to have the characters live together in a house. And then he turns the camera on them. I was not afforded that luxury. So I asked my producers, I said, I want to do Mike Lee. Can I get 40 days? They were like, you can have one dinner. And so that's what I got. I got a dinner where I brought everybody together, ordered a bunch of food, everybody sat around the table, and we worked out some blocking with camera. But it helped, it helped to introduce people. I encouraged people outside of the set, of the production, to meet up on their own. So the woman who plays Nanai, she would meet up with my great aunt who plays herself in the movie. And so they would walk through the park and they would call each other sister and just really got to know each other as real sisters. And you feel that chemistry. Hopefully on the next one I'll get even more time for
you those 40 days, baby.
Yeah, I know, right?
More of a budget.
Yeah.
I'm going to be asking on behalf of our friend.
She lost her voice.
Yeah.
My parents and I speak Chinglish. We speak a lot of Chinese with English words thrown in there. In order to actually balance it out a little more, I felt like it was okay to have the parents and her speak primarily in English. Also because I think it helps better to illustrate the juxtaposition of her relationship with her family in America and then her relationship with them in China. It was also on account of the fact that Awkwafina doesn't really speak Chinese very well. She had to learn a lot of it for the movie. And we had a dialect coach, and so I ended up simplifying a lot of the Chinese for her. The interesting thing for me every time I go back to China is that it's this interesting marriage of the familiar and the foreign. The familiar being memories and nostalgia and dreams and photos and stories, that you've heard from family. And then the foreign being that it's a foreign country. I go back there, I don't really speak the language enough to understand the news, to understand all the conversations. I miss out on a lot of culture because I don't understand jokes, and then everyone just laughs at me. And also you're bombarded with sensory overload. There's all of these sights and sounds and smells. And so I wanted to bring all of that into the movie because, yeah, I do. I sometimes yearn to go back home, whatever that means, right? To my childhood, to my idea of a place. That place doesn't exist anymore. And maybe never really existed.
In the African American community, we have a thing where we don't necessarily like to tell people if they're sick either. So I wanted to find out if Nana has seen the film yet.
She still doesn't know.
Wow. Oh, she still doesn't know.
That's why she hasn't seen the film, so we can't tell her.
Have the other family members seen it?
Just my parents and my aunt, the woman who plays Gugu. Her family was in LA, and so they saw it.
What did they think?
It's hard to tell. She was really congratulatory and very proud of me. And I said, what do you think? And she said, well, the people around me were crying their eyes out. I think it's difficult for them because it's weird to see your own experience represented on screen, but from a different perspective. And so I'm sure for them it's a process. Also, my aunt doesn't speak English, and so she couldn't understand all of the parts that were in English.
I was good until that they got in the cab and they were going away. I was good until that moment, and then I kind of lost it, and I was a blubbering mess in the last row at that theater. I think it's the Eccles Theater at Sundance. I was in the last row, and I was sitting back there like this. A mess had gone through all my Kleenex. It was a hot, buttered mess.
There were so many tears at that screening.
Oh my God. I was like, just, and the people around me were crying. Everybody was crying, but everybody was trying to act like they weren't crying. Everybody was trying to be cool. I'm not doing anything. I was so glad that once the narrative of the film stopped and then you showed Nai in real time, ooh, child, I was so relieved because I was a wreck. I was. But that's a testament to your filmmaking.
Thank you very much.
That it touched hearts and it touches lives. And it's a human story. It's not just an Asian story. It's not just a story of some people that live in China. It's a human being story. So thank you.
Thank you very much for saying that. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously been a massive, massive dream for any independent filmmaker to premiere their film at Sundance. And so just getting in was so surreal and such a dream. It's such a loving atmosphere because it's all film lovers. It's a very special place. It's like a winter camp. And I was there the year before with my production company, and they had another film at the festival. Just loved it. Everybody kept saying, you'll be coming there back, but I didn't want to think about it. And so then actually being there and the reactions, I don't know, it was just really surreal. Yeah, it was really surreal because you also, in a way, feel like, oh, you're so loved here and you're so well taken care of. They're like family. Sundance, they're people who love movies and they get this kind of a movie. But is it going to work in the rest of the world? And so that was always in the back of my head was enjoy this moment because, it may not be the same once we're out of Sundance and be prepared for that. So.
Speaking of your real family, they look like they're a very colorful bunch. The karaoke scene. Why did you decide to include that? And of all the stories about your family that you could have told, why this particular story?
The bride and the Japanese groom singing the karaoke. That actually happened, and that was one of the moments in which I was sad and I wanted to cry, but I was also just laughing on the inside. And it's one of those things, I think everybody's doing their own thing, so nobody's paying attention. But that's the kind of thing that caught my eye, where I was just like, this is ridiculous. Yeah, I think because, when it happened, I immediately said, my family is ridiculous. This is what I've been saying all along. And it sort of summed it up in that way, where I'm like, only my family could do this. This is why I love screwball setups, because life is filled with so many screwball setups. And so it was... I think that this particular scenario brought all of the things I love about my family, which is the range of emotions all into one place in a very short period of time. It sort of just consolidated all of these emotions. All the fights that my mother and I have ever had about my career and my life and my choices and all the bad grades I got, all of that, came out during this week and somehow got attached to my wanting to say goodbye and wanting to tell my grandma the truth. And my dad, the way that he often deals with things by not talking about them and just drinks and all of those things in one place, I think just makes it a really ripe story.
Do you think that's an old school way of thinking? Because I feel like our generation is much more open about things, and the couple of generations before us seem to be a little more... I remember telling my mother that I was going to go to therapy at one point, and she had a nervous breakdown. She was like, you don't tell other people outside the family business. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that's true. Although my parents themselves are storytellers. My mother's a writer. My father was a diplomat in the Soviet Union. And so he's very open. We just had a dinner where New York Times was photographing and writing a story about it. And the reporter came up to me halfway through and she was like, I love your dad. He's awesome. I was like, well, it's because he's a diplomat. She's like, I know, in the Soviet Union. He told me the whole thing. I was like, oh, God. And she would sometimes ask him questions and he would start to answer. And I was like, Dad, she's a reporter. Just, I know you've had a few drinks, but keep in mind it's gonna be in the New York Times next week. So
yeah, you might want to shut that down.
Yeah, exactly. Not the truth here.
That is pure comedy.
Yeah.
The USSR. Wow. Does he speak Russian?
Yeah. Fluent.
Do you speak?
No, not at all.
I was curious what the most challenging part of adapting the story first for This American Life was like, and then making that transition from taking the This American Life piece and turning it into a script and then turning it into a feature.
Well, this is a story, a very intimate story that works for radio. How do you get it to work on a bigger scale? I didn't always have the answers to certain questions like, okay, in the radio story, the protagonist is not very active. And in my real life, the protagonist is not active. That is the challenge. She cannot be an active protagonist because the very premise of the movie is for her to be inactive. It's to not talk, to not do anything crazy. And so I think that there was the push to go, well, that's not going to work for a movie. Because for a movie, the protagonist has to be doing something. We can't just have her sitting around. Anything that I made her do felt very artificial, right? And so I just was trying to balance like that tension. So then how do you make it visually interesting when you don't have an active protagonist? How do you carry the tension from scene to scene without people feeling that it gets repetitive? Just how do you do all of that visually? How do you put the humor visually when you can't just tell a joke? And I didn't want to rely on characters doing a shtick or telling a joke.
What's next for you?
I'm working on a couple things. Since I cut my brother out of this movie, he was working at the time and he didn't come to the wedding, so I made her an only child. I'm doing a TV show that I just set up around him. He's a chef, so it's about a young Chinese-American chef working in a very interesting industry that's filled with toxic male masculinity, racism, sexism, appropriation, and what is it like being the child of a first-generation immigrant family working in this fine dining restaurant industry. And then the other project I'm working on is a feature film that is based on a short story, and it's a very grounded sci-fi story. It still continues to explore the dynamics of family, but in a near future setting.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations on everything.
Thank you. Great to meet you guys.
Great to meet you too.